So power. What do I mean by the power of a test? So the easiest definition, I think, is that the power of a test is the probability that you correctly reject given the HO is actually false. So it's a conditional probability. In statistics, we need to know how to increase power or what things affect power. But generally, power is just the probability that you will correctly reject a false null hypothesis. Here's a useful little tree diagram. The left side is what really happens in reality, and the right side is the decision that you make. So in reality, if the null hypothesis is true, I could either reject or fail to reject. If I were to reject, this would be a type 1 error. And the alpha level is the probability that you make that type 1 error. If you fail to reject, there is no error made. And the probability of that happening is 1 minus alpha. It's the probability that you make a correct decision when HO is true. Now, what if the alternate is true? This is HA, which might be a little bit hard to see. That is HA. If you rejected the null hypothesis when HA is true, there is no error there. That's a good decision. But if you failed to reject, this would be a type 2 error. And beta, the Greek letter beta, it's the probability of committing that type 2 error. 1 minus beta is the power of our test. In other words, what's the probability that you make a correct decision when HA is actually true? Or when you correctly reject when the null hypothesis is false. So some things about power. 5 things to think about. Power is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is false. Power is the probability of making a correct decision when the null hypothesis is false. In other words, you reject correctly. Power is the probability that a test of significance will pick up on an effect that is present. We'll talk about that you probably have no control over it. But basically, the more extreme our sample is, the more likely it is to correctly reject our null hypothesis. Power is the probability that a test of significance will detect a deviation from the null hypothesis should such a deviation exist. In other words, you will be able to tell when the null hypothesis is false, when it actually is. And the power is the probability of avoiding a type 2 error. So how can we make power, factors that increase power? How can we increase the power or change the power? One thing to do is just to change the significance level of the test. In other words, if the alpha level increases, the power increases. If you increase the alpha level, so say if my alpha goes from 0.01 to 0.10, I'm going to reject more things. And I'll actually reject some things incorrectly, but I'll also reject things correctly. So I'm increasing the chance that I'm rejecting something correctly. So as alpha increases, my power increases. Another thing I can control is I can control my sample size. So if my sample size goes up, my power goes up. When my sample size goes up, the standard deviation of my parameter goes down, which makes any difference between the null hypothesis and my p hat. It just makes it easier to detect the differences. And that's kind of what this question is saying. The inherent variability of the measured response variable. What the heck does that mean? So in other words, if something is more variable, if my p hat is more variable, it tends to vary more, then the power of my test goes down. So if I have a more consistent sample, my power goes up. And to get a more consistent sample, you typically increase the sample size. And again, if I get a sample that is way far away from my null hypothesis value, if I get a sample that is way far away, that difference should be easier to detect, and I would be more likely to correctly reject my null hypothesis. And so that is all about power and the things that you need to do to identify when the power would increase or decrease and what things affect them. The big thing to remember is that if you increase your sample size or increase your alpha level, those are the things that you can control. And when you increase those things, the power of your test typically goes up. That's that, kid. Hope this has been helpful.